The third episode of Doctor Who Flux brings us to the halfway point of what has been promoted as a serialised 6-part Doctor Who series, and sure provides a lot to talk about. So doing that talking today will be myself, Neo from Australia, along with Ingiga and Oliver from England as well. We're going to get into lots of topics like preferred versions of history, the change in directors, whether people would have liked this episode more if it had been by someone else and what that kind of argument means in the first place, what this episode says about backstory and story in general, space laws, morality, why people compare Doctor Who to other Doctor Who all the time, the too early to judge argument again, appeals to possibility, writing off a series, and the nature of serialized series in general. But to start, I would like to start how we usually do, by asking what we liked about the episode. So, Oliver, what did you like about Once Upon a Time?
So, the big note I've got, which feels a little unfair in retrospect, is Baby's first conceptual sci-fi, which is sort of what this is. It's got all the weird timelines in themselves, all the visual storytelling and weird creative fuckery, which feels like an extension of the stuff that Flux has already been doing. But I dig it. It's a bit simple and a bit obvious, but I really like it. It's what I like my sci-fi to be.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that a hell of a lot.
Anything else?
I enjoyed the episode a lot watching it. It's probably my favourite of the series so far. But the more time I spend thinking about it, the more sort of hollow the whole thing is. Scene for scene, I had a pretty great time with it.
Yeah.
But what's the actual content of this episode? I don't really know. It's filling in backstory that was mostly assumed.
Those are interesting questions.
I did fucking love the Angels. This is my favourite Angel appearance since the Angels Take Manhattan.
The video game idea was inspired.
Yeah. The Angels is something that haunts media. That's so my take on them.
Absolutely.
That's what I love them to be.
Well, I can echo the pro Angels comments. I thought the appearances of the Angels in the video game and piloting the TARDIS at the end, I think those were, the only blasts of that same sense of kind of dumb fun that has that sort of serves as the highlights of Chibnall episodes most of the time. So it was nice to get those, and the idea that they were stalking Yaz somehow, stalking her timeline, and just basically loose in this whole time maelstrom that they were all floating around in. I thought they were certainly more compelling than the time mites. So yeah, the Angels were a nice little add-on in this episode, I suppose.
Two things I liked were, well, one, I like these kinds of episodes in general. I love episodes of TV that are a bunch of vignettes that peer into different worlds or peer into different characters. Like I said last week about how I enjoyed some of the Brendan stuff in Ascension of the Cybermen, I just like this kind of structure in general a lot. I mean, Chibnall's done it himself before, kind of, in Fragments in Torchwood, which was more of a typical flashback episode you used to get in shows like Buffy and whatnot that Torchwood was riffing off at the time. But I just like this structure, this kind of short story style of storytelling. I like that a lot. And I also really preferred the director this week than the guy who's doing episodes 1, 2, and 4. I liked... It kind of went back to the kind of Chibnall House style, and we had more big, extreme, wide shots, more kind of ostentatious symmetry, more lens flare. But I also really liked the things like... At the start, when we flashed back to the end of episode 2, where we had these shots, it stayed on Jodie's face, but it cut angles to like disorient us, and it did it with Mr. Williamson as well. I liked that technique. And I liked the darkness. I liked, in the Serpent guy's place, I really liked how the colours looked rich and everything. I liked how there was almost a Gordon Willis kind of darkness in the cop car with Yaz and 13. I liked the visual approach of this episode much more than the last two.
Yeah, I thought the directing was really strong.
When we were seeing the end of last episode from the Doctor's point of view right at the start, I thought that was very well handled as well.
I love the point of view stuff, yeah.
Kind of gave me Heaven Sent vibes there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, I thought the same. I really liked that.
Yeah, that whole opening sequence, it feels like quite a straight Capaldi era idea. But I thought it was really well handled, well directed throughout, actually. All the cuts that happen on specific lines in the flashbacks, like sit down to Vinder, and we cut to him sitting down in the pod, stuff like that. Incredible.
I loved that. It was visual storytelling.
Visual storytelling. Who would have thunk it?
No, I really, really love that. It's when the episode over-explained some things, it stung me more than it usually would in this era, because we were actually getting more interesting visual storytelling than we normally do, I think. And I think the episode could have functioned really well off those kind of moments, like the cut with Vinder sitting down there. Yeah, for sure.
No, it really is a game of two halves, in that all the bits that go unexplained, all the random ideas and bits and bobs of creative visuals and whatnot are incredible and exactly what I want from Doctor Who. And the rest of the runtime is the Doctor shouting explanations of those things we've just seen.
Yeah.
In a blue void.
It was the thing I disliked most about the episode was the tendency to over-explain itself. Like, the thing with how John Bishop was playing Carvanista, the first time when he was referred to as a dog, I laughed because I thought that was a cute little thing that, like, the persona he's taking on in this timey-wimey thing is actually Carvanista's. And then there was a second beat related to that later where he used Carvanista's axe and had, like, this big shot where the light, came out of the axe and was all very focused. And so you could go, oh, he's Carvanista. And I laughed again because I thought it's a funny idea since they're so antagonistic. And then later on, of course, we get the third beat where we have this kind of belabored explanation of the joke. And I feel like we were getting that in so many spheres in this episode. Like when Belle at the end is touching her stomach, and we know what this means. This is very common visual language to indicate pregnancy, but what's her line again?
As yet unborn child.
Yeah, it's like we talked about last week with Chibnall being his own worst enemy sometimes. It's lines like that just unravel what potential good storytelling there could be, visually or otherwise, I think. And it's a real pain to me because I really like a lot of ideas of this episode, but its tendency to maybe not have faith in its audience to go along with them just frustrates me so much. I kind of wish this episode would have stopped cutting back to the more present day stuff, or stopped cutting to the Doctor explaining things, because I love the idea of this timey-wimey thing is fragmented everyone up into these storylines that reflect something about their character or backstory. Let's go play there for a while. That's really cool. But then the Doctor interrupts them and she explains this is what's going on. And she does it to all of them. So we keep getting this explanation again and again and again. And we get it in the present day stuff as well. I just don't understand why Chibnall keeps doing this exactly.
It was interesting how, before the episode, Strevens was saying how this episode credits the viewer with sophistication and intelligence and stuff like that. When watching it, it's like, actually, you get the impression that it doesn't really trust us very much at all. Like, it's doing the whole elaborate gimmick conceit of jumbling everything up, but it doesn't actually trust itself to just go with that. It's just constantly just treating us like idiots. Yeah, read it out, please.
Yeah, I want to read that out in full if no one's heard it, because I think it lends a really interesting context to the episode. So this came out a few days before this episode. This is what I was entering the episode with in mind. So Strevens, the other executive producer, said, the episode is very ambitious and it credits the audience with sophistication and intelligence, which is something we always do, of course, but with this, it's very much asking you to trust the show and go on a ride. Not everything is given to you in the moment. As with a lot of television now, it credits the audience with a degree of patience that they're not going to know quite what's going on. And Chibnall said the episode is very serialized, connecting to everything that's gone before it. You couldn't tell this particular story with this particular structure in any other season of Doctor Who. They're using the shape of a serial to give us a very different type of storytelling. And finally, Strevens again said this is a form of storytelling we haven't really done before. For me, it was reminiscent of some of the shows I love, of the way that Marvel Studios are telling stories, the way they'll parcel out the information and things can seem incredibly random and abstract, but they're not in the end. They're part of a very cohesive whole, but you don't get served that straight away.
It's got all those moments of requiring patience and creative thinking for the audience, and then it just tells them as well, which is why it's so frustrating, because all the elements of an actual engaging story that requires you to put in some legwork yourself are there. And there's lots of scenes that in themselves require the audience to properly engage, but then a scene later will explain them retrospectively, which if you figured it out the first time, is very boring.
It's interesting because I think some of the people with more faith in the series than us have been using arguments like, it's a serialized show, the 6 episodes aren't complete yet, therefore it's hasty to judge elements as not serviceable in a specific episode because they may or may not pay off yet, because that's casting your mind to the future, which hasn't happened yet. That's not treating the episodes as what they are. But I feel like, again, it's like I said in an earlier discussion, how I feel like talking about the show as when it will be a finished unit is doing a disservice to Chibnall and Strevens, because that's not what they've made it as. And the way they talk up the cliffhangers and everything, they're clearly showing pride in how they've made it a weekly show. So I feel like the thing of saying you can't judge some things until later, or it's not great criticism to judge things until later, isn't really connecting with what Chibnall and Strevens are saying here and doing here, which is saying they're crediting the audience with sophistication and intelligence and then going out of their way to explain everything within the episode. It feels like in this episode, they're trying to reassure me that things do make sense, rather than what I feel like some fans are saying, in that, no, you should wait until episode 6 when they explain things. I feel like they're trying to explain things now, and it's annoying me because I would enjoy it more if I was a little bit more lost, or if I had a little less context. I feel like that would be more engaging.
Yeah.
I can't help but feel like a lot of the repeated explaining stuff and the words, you know, your time stream has gone corrupted and I'm getting sucked back to the Temple of Atropos and I've thrown myself to the time slot, blah, 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 blah. I feel like a lot of that might be just trying to paper over what would otherwise be gaps in the script or in the story. Because I can't help but feel that, to some degree, the ideas that are actually at the centre of all this and the story being told, when we consider that it's essentially just the Doctor floating in the void until she can sort of zoop some things over here and over there to unfuck whatever is happening, some vague nebulous doom that's happening. I feel like maybe there is not actually, or at least as far as Chibnall's concerned, there is not actually enough material there to get 50 minutes out of, so we just get it filled in with all these unimaginative, repeated explanations and stuff, and just kind of constant, like, look, I'm doing a gimmick, and I'm going to explain the gimmick to you.
It frustrates me because I feel like the conceit of this sort of episode lets you get away with being a bit more plotless than usual. Like, the characters have been stranded out into these little pocket universe timeline things, which means we could totally get a vignette of Yaz that was just character focused on Yaz and didn't necessarily have much to do with the plot per se. I feel like this kind of story gives you an allowance to do that, but then it doesn't really do that so much. It just has it does a little bit, and then it has the Doctor pop up and explain everything, and then it has the monster or the threat come out, and then the vignettes kind of end. It reminds me of Can You Hear Me in a way, in which I really like the idea of narrowing down on these character-centric things, but then I don't feel like the episodes are engaging with them with as much depth as I would like. And it's just annoying that the script would be papering over stuff, because I feel like an episode this lets you expand in a way kind of free of Doctor Who strictures of you need the monsters, you need all this. This is everyone split up across time. We could totally have the more character-focused, less dramatic stuff.
If you think about what we got Vinder's whole backstory, we got Dan and Diane a little bit, a bit of fleshing out of Dan and Diane's relationship, I suppose, which is good. And then Yaz just got, Yaz, it didn't really need to be Yaz in that scene at all, did it? When she was playing the video games with her sister, it was like, that was pretty throwaway. So Yaz got the short end of the stick again, really, because her bits were just setting up the angels that were going to have attack next episode. So someone always seems to get the short end of the stick when we get these vignette things. Just like in Can You Hear Me, the Doctor got a tease instead of an actual character thing. So it's just very, like, unbalanced, I think.
Yeah, Yaz, like last week, just gets jumped off into setting up the next episode. Right, there's no story for her here. There's no actual drama that we're seeing in the same way that we actually get backstory for Vinder and Dan. I don't think we really needed either of those backstories. Vinder's is a very long way of explaining that he got stationed on that station for a heroic reason, which we had sort of assumed anyway, I thought. But Yaz doesn't even get that. She gets absolutely nothing except setting up the next episode and receiving some exposition. And the Doctor's, although it is about her and it is a backstory flashback, it's obviously Timeless Child stuff, so doesn't actually reveal anything about her as a person. So you've got Yaz and the Doctor again, like in Can You Hear Me and like last week, just getting arc stuff, just plot.
Yeah. The interesting thing with the structure to me that I think we're getting at is that the premise of an episode like this really lends itself to imaginative stuff, lends itself to character-based stuff. But we get stuff like Daleks, Cybermen, Sontar doing what they normally do. We get even the nature of the plot resolution is, it seemed to me basically, the Doctor goes into the timey-wimey place to ask the Mori to spawn more Mori to fix the problem at the end of episode 2, and they do that. It's like, it's this imaginative premise, and then there's like a lack of imagination filling in the actual story. It's like the Vinder thing you were talking about. It's such a stock type of story with no real spin on it that it's just confuses me why this is the stuff being told, when I think the premise is really good. It's a great premise of an episode. And I think it's been done pretty well before. Fragments isn't my favourite Torchwood episode, but I think it's a completely competent take on that similar kind of structure. And I guess that's the thing I'm feeling with Flux overall so far, is that I love this idea. I love the timey-wimey idea. I love the more serialized idea. But for some reason, I'm feeling so much emptiness in the actual stuff. And I feel like it should lend itself to so much more imagination. And I don't know why that isn't happening.
Fragments kind of has a sort of linking theme to it, in that each of the characters who's trapped in the wreckage or whatever, we're finding out something about them that makes them tick.
Yeah.
You know, we're getting some sort of insight into, you know, who they are, who they were at the start, their origins, and it's all interesting because we've been with these characters for a while. We want to see what makes them tick and stuff like that. And in this story, essentially, I think it's a bit too transparent that what we're getting is not actually any sort of true linking theme, but just essentially gimmickry. And I think that may have contributed to some of the polarizing kind of divisive nature of this episode, because some people really hate it. And I think moments like when like, you know, some scenes will just like stop dead, and then we get sector 17XJ57PXB blah 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 gibberish, right? And I think stuff like that, it's making it very transparent that it's kind of like, I don't want to say it, but pretentious is the word that comes to mind. I think it's too obvious that rather than a linking theme like, you know, Fragments has, this really is just fucking around like in a sand pit. And I think that maybe exhausts people when you're just jumping around so much and no underlying larger truth is necessarily emerging.
Yeah, Zagreus is the other comparative episode, right? Which, to mixed success, I think. Zagreus uses its abstract cast members filling in lore characters thing. It uses that to say something about the doctors who are in those roles, right?
Yeah.
But there's none of that here. Nothing is imparted to us about who any of the characters are by the roles that they're filling in other people's stories. And that's not absolutely essential, but why as a writer would you not take that opportunity? And I think, I don't want to jump ahead in the conversation, but, I mean, that's just it. There's this absolutely overbearing sense of Chibnallness about the whole thing, where there's lots of brilliant ideas, lots of really cool things, but all of them are just weighed down with a fundamental lack of a reason to exist.
I love that you brought up Zagreus, because apart from the kind of similarities in premise, and I want to get more into why we compare Doctor Who later, but in no way am I suggesting Chris Chibnall has ever heard this over 3-hour 40th anniversary audio drama. I don't think any connections are like that. There's only so many sci-fi ideas in the world. It's why I get so confused by people thinking people are actually plagiarizing Alan Moore and Lawrence Miles and whoever else. But anyway, the thing with Zagreus is that it's long as fuck. It's so long. And it's controversial. Like, fans have big opinions on that story. But I don't think you can deny it's full of stuff. There's loads of ideas in it, whether you like it or not. There's loads of weirdness in it. There's weird castings. There's very weird decisions. It has a very weird relationship to the story right before it as well. It means there's so much to talk about when you get to Zagreus. But here, even though there's a similar kind of setup, it just feels so hollow to me because the actual segments we get seem to be doing so little. It's like that thing with Yaz and her sister we were talking about. I love the Angel video game thing, and we can read into that heaps in a fun way. But the actual conversation she's having with her sister, I just feel like there's so much more I want to learn about these characters. And it's been over 20 episodes now with Yaz, and I still feel this absolute lack. And I really don't want that to be there anymore. And after this many episodes, it just feels comedic to me to still be lacking that, especially in these type of episodes which seem based around giving characterization, giving allowance to time spent on that sort of thing.
I think when we talk about maybe the paucity of sort of stuffness that this has relative to something like Zagreus or whatever, I think you can kind of look at this episode and you can kind of, if you just gently fold away all of the frippery and kind of gimmickry and sort of madness that's floating around and look at what are the core ideas at work here and like what's actually happening. So we've got Belle in this dystopian environment where Sontarans, Daleks and Cybermen are all competing for space. We've got the Doctor's past with the Division, where she's basically storming in with her SWAT team to take down some baddies who are gonna just massacre like a shitload of people because they want to end the universe or whatever. You've got Vinder, who is, I guess, some sort of officer or whatever, who witnesses a kind of corrupt politician guy get some people killed and then gets demoted for it. And time's doing this, time's doing that. And I think that what links all of these things is that... and one more thing. Also, of course, we've got the particles floating around, just randomly killing people too.
Also Big Finish style.
What links all of this, and I think links it back to maybe stuff like Ascension of the Cybermen as well, and even Ranscore, is I think there's just this drabness to all of the core ideas that Chibnall seems to have here, like regarding like Flux and regarding what the Flux is doing to the universe, like this kind of quasi-time war setup, regarding the Doctor's secret past, regarding Vinder's backstory. It all seems to exist on this same plane of just kind of self-seriousness, kind of people trying to be big space cops or fighting pew-pew battles with monsters. And it's kind of not really what I want from Doctor Who, because all of that I just feel so dour and so just kind of boring to me. I thought of it as Doctor Who conceived on the level of clashing action figures together, except rather than like a child clashing action figures together and getting that sort of like zany, freewheeling, kind of colourful madness, like last week with, Carvanista jumping out of the sewer pipe or ramming spaceships into each other, like that sort of thing. Instead, here we just get like the adult version of that, where like it feels this need to be kind of serious and just not very fun. And I think it's annoying to have that at the core of something like this, because it just leads to the whole thing just being kind of like, I just don't even know why.
I didn't realise it until you just mentioned, but 3 of the 4 flashback sequences are about cops. 3 of them are cop stories. You've got Yaz's cop backstory, you've got Vinder being a space cop, and you've got the Doctor being a time cop. It's all cops, all the way down, because that's what Chibnall knows how to write, and that's how he's overhauling Doctor Who. He's doing it as, what if Doctor Who was a cop show? Because it's the thing he can write.
The cop stuff is interesting, because I feel like it's one of the things in this episode, and this era, that there is something to chew on there. There is some kind of ideology or thinking. I don't feel like it's hollow, the cop thing. I feel like we're actually seeing at least some idea for Doctor Who or some running theme of Chibnall's there. The thing with Vinder is like such an idealism thing, because he gets told very specifically, if you submit this report, it won't do anything and you'll get punished. And so he submits it anyway, and the guy clarifies that the only thing that's going to happen when you submit this is that you're going to get punished. And he submits it. And it characterizes Vinder, I think, in a very trope-laden way, but it does achieve that. But it also fits into this big pattern of the era where, how would you describe, either of you, the 13th Doctor's relationship to laws?
Well, she's there to sort out fair play across the universe. She's a law enforcer, but the sort of ideal, well, the abstract ideal, she's a good cop, basically.
It's that sense of impotence, isn't it? Like, she can't really, like, that idea of not really being able to overturn injustice as long as you're following these kind of abstract, vague rules, but at least you wanted to, and that's what counts, really, isn't it?
I feel like there's an interesting tension between Doctor Who, which is kind of usually a adventure, explorative show. The Doctor's often the kind of rebel figure that breaks things up, breaks civilizations up, causes chaos, causes havoc. They don't need to be written this way, and they're not always written this way, but it's kind of baked into how the show is usually written. And then this thing with this era where the Doctor is very much kind of, like Oliver said, sorting out fair play throughout the universe is how she's characterized very early on. And the thing with the Vinder scene is it seems to be saying he's going to do something according to the rules because they are rules. And the rules are in place, and the rules are the rules, so we're going to follow the rules. There's this kind of inherent vaunting or glorification of the rules themselves, and I think the tension that has with Doctor Who is interesting, but it might not make them interesting episodes, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Okay, I think it kind of, the whole obsession with laws and stuff, I think it poses a problem for the Ruth and Division material, because in those sequences in this episode, Swarm kind of tries to do that whole Toby Whithouse thing of trying to get a dig in on the Doctor's sense of ethics, like, oh, it must be so compromising working for the Division, oh, you're going to kill us if we don't stop killing people, ooh, I really owned you there, and it's like, obviously it's completely hollow, like, there's no actual, like, own of the Doctor or the Division there, and just, you're gonna stop us, blah blah blah. But like, I think the issue with having the secret past of the Doctor's, where she was kind of this action kind of cop-like figure, is that she's not actually that different from how 13 is in the present day. So it's not really used to, they don't really use this idea to show a difference in values between the old Doctor and the new Doctor. Like, we don't see the old Doctor do anything that the new Doctor would really be ashamed of or, like, you know, horrified by. It's so it's just like the opportunity for conflict there is just squandered.
It's like in Fugitive that the Doctor doesn't use guns, and she says, well, the Doctor doesn't use guns, and Ruth's like, yeah, no, you're right. Right, that was an opportunity to differentiate them, but no, they're basically the same person.
There's even that moment when the Division fam are squaring up to go into the temple, where they outline their MO is like rescue hostages, end the siege, reset time, universe is fixed, and then they say risking our lives to save others, the usual. So this secretive, mysterious backstory of the Doctor is still framed in the exact same thing she does now, risking her life to save others. It's just the Ruth thing with the guns is amazing to me, because Ruth feels so set up. The whole point of interest is that this is a mysterious Doctor. This is a Doctor different to the ones we know. It's a Doctor we don't know about. And then it's like immediately handicapped by, oh, she's not actually different. She has the police box. She also thinks guns are bad. It's just this amazing kind of redundancy.
I can't help but feel like it all might be heading in some sort of Division apologism direction, because here we get the sense that the Temple of Atropos is their dirty little secret, or whatever, as Swarm puts it, but essentially what the Division seem to be trying to do is to constrain the evil force of time so that the dark times will end and the universe can evolve or whatever. And I feel like it seems, and considering that the people on Time's side, so Swarm and Azure, are just, you know, monstrous murderers and cackling hammy villains, it's like, are we meant to, we're not exactly going to be siding with them, are we? So it seems very hard to kind of really invest in this idea that Division is some dark force of doom or evil, except for the fact that they wiped the Doctor's memory, of course. So it's all just quite intangible.
This is the big tension of the series for me, and it's also the moment I decided I was going to write about Flux as a thing. Because one of the big things that interested me about Series 12, sort of following on from the Capaldi era, is this idea of authority and the Doctor as a imposer of order against the chaos of the universe, right?
Yeah.
Which ties up with the stuff I mentioned last week about this cultural moment we're in, where sci-fi is all about unleashing timelines and toppling institutions. So the big tension of this series for me is the Division going to be the good guys? Because the implication from this episode is that the bad guys have a point, right? It feels like we're heading in the direction of, sure, maybe their methods are bad, but the real problem was the Division stifling the potential of the universe for the sake of power. You know, they're an institution anchoring time in a way that serves them. But is it going that way? Or is the ending going to be the Doctor re-anchoring time and vowing to protect the order of the universe forever and ever? Because that's her job as a time cop. Like, the drama of which way that's going.
Like, they mentioned the eternal conflict between time and space, and the way they phrase it in an almost Fenric-like way, like this has been going on since the very beginning, and the time and space have always been at war with each other, and I guess the implication almost is that because he complains that building a physical planet to contain time is heresy, I guess it's like the idea seems to be that having physical form, matter, sort of, I guess, logic in the universe at all is kind of the space side of things, and it's kind of necessary for people to have lives and for people to just have their existences as we know them. So it feels kind of very hard for Chib to kind of side against all of that and say, actually no, formless chaos is the good side actually. So yeah, but at the same time it might all be thrown in the bin, considering that mysterious lady who turns up at the end saying like, oh well, your universe is doomed, who cares, there's bigger fish to fry, I transcend all of this. So I don't know, I feel like we might not get a satisfying resolution to this dilemma in the first place.
The space-time opposing forces thing, which is a very weird, hammy speech. Like, I'm usually up for weird, oh, you have no idea of this concept, here's a name we're throwing out which you don't understand. I usually like that kind of stuff in Doctor Who because it feels big, makes the universe bigger, makes things more interesting. And then I'm usually amused when some extended universe thing drags it down. Like how RTD builds up all these could have been king, all these Time War monstrosities, and then in the EU somewhere someone writes it as, oh, it was a really big Dalek, all this kind of thing. But here, I literally just don't understand at all what Swarm was talking about. To a degree, it was actually kind of affecting my investment in the story because I was so confused by what he... Like, a planet called Time that controls time. It's unimaginative, but I kind of get what it's going for, especially since, like, Zagreus did a similar thing with Rassilon and the Web of Time and everything. But the battle between time and space, what does that mean? Time shall never surrender to space. Nothing can imprison time. It's not necessarily a problem, but I was genuinely confused. I guess I was saying earlier I wish I was confounded by more stuff in the series, so I guess I was in that scene, so that's some kind of success.
It does feel like the sort of idea that would come up in like a sort of Lego Doctor Who kind of fan film, sort of written by like a 13-year-old or something. It's that thing like, time and space are mentioned in association with each other a lot. Space-time's kind of a concept, this idea that there's a link. What if they fought each other? And admittedly, if you were some crazy ass like faction paradox writer, you could write some crazy mind-bending Jim Mortimer thing like that. Yeah. But here it manifests as, particles, like time particles flying around, zapping people. Some cackling villains, zapping people. And again, it comes back to that drabness, I think. So we can't get the potential of some insane concept. It just ends up being the sort of, I guess, the kind of superficial nonsense that it sounds like when you hear it.
Yeah, what really struck me is that this is the midpoint of the series, right? We've been talking about serialization and the build-up of the first two episodes and how it's all just throwing stuff at the screen and hoping it sticks. And there's still just more throwing stuff at the screen, adding new plot lines, adding new characters. We've got 2 new villains who are presumably going to be big bads across the rest of the series on top of the several we already had, which is a bit ridiculous. But it's also, as the midpoint, we're beginning to get payoffs, sort of. And this is the first time I've really felt it crashing down around my ears. This is the first time I've really clicked that, this is going to be unsatisfying, and now I can see how it's going to be unsatisfying. The fact that the Flux is a separate thing to Swarm and Azure, which is a separate thing to the anchoring of time and the war between time and space, which is sort of not really connected to the big villain, and it's all just messy. And I really get the impression now, and going forwards, that it will just get messier and messier and nothing's really going to tie up. And I began to feel that with this episode.
It's funny you bring up the kind of confusing doubling up of like having the Flux and the Swarm, because I remember that was exactly what confused me about Zagreus back in the day, was how it kind of walked back the Never people or whatever in Neverland, and it came up with basically the same idea with a different name. Just a funny little similarity.
Yeah. I mean, Chibnall's writing is full of that. Adding too many ideas on top of each other that should neatly tie together. They're like the Death Particle and the Cyberium as two deadly forces that you need to grab out of somebody and use as a weapon. They're in the same story. They're the same thing. They do exactly the same thing in the story, and there's two of them, rather than just folding them into one idea.
Desolation and Ranskor of Kolos in Series 11, two barren planets ruined by the Stenza.
Yeah, exactly.
It comes. I'm not trying to besmirch the effort he puts into the show or the effort he puts into the scripts. I've read them. I see how many beats he puts in, but it comes back. It comes back to that kind of underwritten feeling, like when we were talking about the Halloween apocalypse. So now we kept coming back to the point of things not cohering together when they probably could without that much adjustment. And so when you have like these doubling up of concepts, it just feels again like this could have been fixed, and even just with dialogue in some cases. And so it's this kind of slapdash feeling of, I can see the potential and possibility here, so I kind of get why some people make that appeal to, well, if it was like this, you would have thought this so much, but it's not. So we get what we get.
This is a script I'll definitely be reading when it's out, because this is the kind of shit I write. And so it was frustrating watching this going, why would that video game scene, why would you not use that as an opportunity to say something about Yaz? You've got a whole scene just setting up a monster there. That's worthless. That's bad writing. It's the kind of thing that I would love to take this script apart and see where all the clever ideas come in and see how much fat there is on it. I'd be really interested in reading this compared to his other ones, which I found quite bland.
Do you want to, Oliver, touch on why the Angel video game thing works so well?
Oh, yeah, sure. I fucking love the Angels. They're my favourite. They're my absolute favourite. And I was worried that this series, in doing the Angels, would just do Blink again. And watching the first episode, I was almost certain that they were just doing Blink again. It's a timey-wimey story about a bunch of angels trying to get something and the Doctor trying to stop them, and it's all bootstrap paradoxes. But that's not so much the interesting part about the Angels. That's the starting point. But I think where I get fascinated by the Angels is in the idea of the image of the Angels. Not so much as it's first introduced as this cop-out explanation for why you can't just take a photo of them, which is definitely where the idea came from. But the way that develops across that story and the Angels Take Manhattan and the sort of wider writing about the Angels, where they become not so much creatures or monsters as conceptual threats, sort of mimetic
means. Yes.
Yeah. The way I like to put it is the image of an angel is an angel, and therefore the angel is the image. The idea that what they actually are, they're not things that come from a planet somewhere, there's not big eggs that hatch weeping angels, but they are the image imprinted on the universe of the angels, which is why in my head, that's why angels as an image occur across all human cultures. Winged creatures who look like humans turn up all over the place because they're just a fact of the universe.
Yeah.
And the observation, the fact that they exist in being observed, has this nice meta narrative stuff, which is all how Moffat writes. That's all that Angels Take Manhattan is. And so them being media haunters who jump out of video games. That's what I loved about the phone game, whatever that was called.
Lonely Assassins, yeah.
Lonely Assassins was that it really leaned into that idea of angels as creatures that come to get you out of the TV screen, that are threats to the audience more than the characters. These sort of deterministic loop creatures that's only function is to serve the narrative purpose of being a scary monster. I love them. I love them so much.
I think the whole image of an angel thing also kind of provides a cool kind of retroactive justification for them being statues in the first place. Because what are statues if not the representation of an image, you know? So it's like that. So it all kind of comes together in a quite neat way. So, and yeah, I love them jumping out of the console. I love them doing all of that shit. Although, I guess, maybe to a certain extent, if you compare how they jump out of screens here with how they jump out of screens in Time of Angels, in Time of Angels it very strictly follows the angel rules. So when Amy looks away from the screen, she looks back, suddenly it's come out of the TV, and it's still kind of flickering like the grainy film it was shot on, right? So it's not so much that the angel is able to just casually leap out in full form from a screen while you're looking at it, you know. Whereas I feel like here the cool, specific and nuances of those rules are kind of getting maybe a bit forgotten about in the kind of rush of coolness of having angels pop out of screens and start yanking the TARDIS around and stuff. But you know, it's still fun to actually have that stuff in there. It's nice to have a straight homage to a good scene from an old episode, even if that's all it is. Like Yaz smashing the console to get rid of it. That was cool.
Yeah, the cleverness is definitely lacking. You know, the real genius of that scene is that Amy gets it on the blip. She knows that the power is in the image, so she gets it in the moment where it doesn't have that image, so it isn't an angel. And the fact that it's not an angel means she can turn it off, where Yaz just sort of unplugs the thing and then smack, which doesn't quite work. But the scene broadly does, I think. And to be honest, I'm amazed that they're leaning into those ideas at all for the angels. That's not what I expected. I thought it would just be Blink again.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because people do whine about how Moffat changed the angels. So it would have been sensible to expect Chibnall to revert back to old angels. Yeah. So it's kind of nice that he didn't. That's relief.
Catching the angel on the blip, I love that so much. It fits into this wider Moffat pattern. I know in his sitcoms he termed it techno-fast, where he gets really interested in the kind of messiness of technology, or analog technology or digital technology, the kind of hiccups with it, rather than the smooth functioning of it, and then mining comedy or drama or horror out of that. I love how it works on that level. The video game stuff, not to a huge degree, but I liked having the menu come up like out of the screen.
Yeah. That's the classic Moffat thing of pause slipping.
Yeah.
Which I'm slightly too young to really get by the time. Well, maybe I just had good enough DVD players that they never pause slipped. But that's the thing that comes up in his work again and again and in Blink, right? The idea of a pause button just stopping working and the image comes to life. Yeah, that whole it's sort of the example of why it's a bit risky having anyone who isn't Moffat write the angels, because they're so folded into everything about how he writes, all the themes he's interested in, the determinism, the stories being stories, aware that they're stories, all of that is what the angels are. And it's a bit odd seeing someone else giving that a go.
I think this episode does ably illustrate that when you have Moffat come up with a being that haunts time, you have the angels, and when Chibnall comes up with one, you have blue particles that look like they're from like a PS2 game floating around everywhere. And I'm concerned about how much setting up of the particles happens in this episode, because I feel like they're going to come back in episodes 5 and maybe even 6. I'm concerned about how prominent the particles are.
Oh, don't worry. Stuff that Chibnall sets up doesn't necessarily pay off. It's fine.
True.
They might never turn up again.
Here's hoping.
It might not be Dark Eyes 4. If we're talking about story logic with the angels, there's another story logic thing here that interests. Well, there's another story logic thing here. We were talking earlier about the Doctor backstory with Ruth and the Division stuff, and whether this is redundant or not. I feel like an area in which it might not be, in which it might take us to a new area for the character and her relationships, is with her irritability with Yaz over Yaz wanting to know more about the Doctor and wanting to, you know, be open and sharing with her. And the Doctor quite spikily reprimanding her about that. I find that really interesting. I think, and I know people can say, well, it's not finished yet. You know, the era isn't finished yet. Flux isn't finished yet. So therefore you can't judge this yet, or your judgment is lazy or whatever. We've seen, 21 hours of Chibnall's Doctor Who at this point. I have a very good idea of how Yaz and the Doctor's relationship and how it's written works. But still, on that point, I like characterizing the Doctor in this kind of specific way of her being spiky about being questioned about her past. And I feel like, could this characterize in a way that the division stuff, if nothing else, at least it's accomplishing this direction for the character where she's getting kind of fixated on her past, and that's bringing issues to her present with the fam, with Yaz. Do we think this will develop? Are we liking it at the moment?
Andrew Ellard wrote about the Timeless Children that the big problem is that the Doctor doesn't actively go after the memories. And that gets directly fixed in this one in a way that feels like an answer to those tweet notes, where the Doctor actively dives back into the memories, risking her life. And the biggest clue she gets, that conversation with the woman in the cloisters probably, is the direct result of her risking her life, diving back in, which I thought was pretty good. But more broadly, that tension between her and Yaz, it still bores me, because I'm increasingly getting tired of Jodie's Doctor, and I'm sorry, but she's developed a second mode across series 12 where she had the gleeful schoolteacher exposition mode, and then in series 12 she developed the slightly grumpy mode. And it just feels like we flicker back and forth between those two, and there's no actual other layer underneath that. It's nice to see more of the grumpy side, but it doesn't feel like a whole lot to me.
Her jumping back in to try and experience more memories, I know this is a really fundamental thing, but it's the character being proactive, which is exciting.
Yeah.
See, with the Yaz thing, do you guys remember back in, like, the Ghost Monument, the Doctor had that whole moment when she was suddenly like, oh, doom, despair, we're gonna die, and then the fam supported her and stuff like that. What's happening now with 13 and Yaz? And when 13's always kind of shouting down Yaz, like, stop asking about my past, fuck off, Yaz, it kind of just makes Yaz come off as pathetic, because Yaz can never actually... Yaz always just kind of rolls over and says, all right, I'll stop asking then. and it's like, rather than Yaz actually being committed to getting an explanation for why her life is constantly at risk, pursuing these ridiculous mysteries of the Doctor's, instead of Yaz really wanting to be treated like a friend or, you know, a confidant in any way, Yaz just gets shouted down by the Doctor, and then that's just it, and maybe we'll repeat that again at some point. And just, you want Yaz to just, like, get sick of this bullshit, you know? Like, where's Yaz's agency?
I think this is more inconsistent writing rather than larger intent, but I get sometimes uncomfortable with that, because Yaz is introduced to us as a cop wanting more. You know, it's the classic kind of archetype of she's rubbing up against her station, she could do more, she wants to do more, she's being locked down by, you know, this annoying man who's the authority figure over her. And then in Arachnids in the UK, wanting more gets a little bit reframed in terms of being with the Doctor. It's, I want more of the universe, more time with you. And then whenever the Doctor kind of reprimands Yaz or brings it down like that, it's like, yeah, Yaz doesn't react much. She just kind of takes it. And the larger narrative being spun out from that, I think, is a little bit unsettling. I don't love it.
Yeah. It's all the drama isn't drama, right? I fundamentally don't think it makes sense to talk about the character drama as character drama. Every time people try to draw character out of the interactions between Yaz and the Doctor, I just fundamentally don't think that the drama is there. I don't want to dunk on bad takes on Twitter, but I saw someone earlier mentioned that they're loving this era and this series so much because Doctor Who's been stuck in melodrama for 10 years and finally we're back to real sci-fi, which you can only read as characters are bad and I just want nonsense descriptions of stuff, because that's what the actual body of this series is, just descriptions of things and ideas and clumsiness and it's pervasive.
Nebulous concepts at war with each other.
Yeah. It's really upsetting how, because it's not even good at that, right? The big thing that struck me this time was that the resolution to the Doctor Who style resolution to the Doctor Who problem is sneaking the Maoris into the passenger thing, which is fine. That's a fine idea. It's not great that Jodie just nicks it from Ruth, robbing her of being intelligent and figuring it out herself. But it's a fine Doctor Who idea, but the way it's communicated is this long-winded explanation of what the characters are doing and how all the sci-fi ideas work together to make this happen. I always go back to the Flesh and Stone climax where the gravity fails on the spaceship and the angels fall into the crack. And it's not explained. It hinges on like a couple of sentences. It's a very quick catching you up. All the ideas have been set up. They all get tied together in that moment. They're just like, no, really find something to hold on to. Get a grip. That's it. And it all hinges very neatly on that one idea. But here, all the sci-fi ideas are so complex and so unintuitive that you need dialogue and dialogue and dialogue explaining those revelations. So it's not even good sci-fi in the broadest clever ideas interacting way. It's not good drama and it's not clever sci-fi. It's just blah.
Yeah, it's all basically intangible blah. That's the perfect word for it. I think the Mori being these intangible floating things who are going to project themselves here or there or whatever and all of that. Like it's. I mean, you could try, if you were to try and like write out just a description of what happens, it would just be kind of, you'd be talking around it really. I think it's just kind of all very vague and intangible, and it's hard to basically get any sense of stakes to it. It's all just kind of vague, it's all nebulous, and it's all just sort of just floating around in just this mishmash of whatever.
I use the word amaterial a lot.
Oh, that's good. Amaterial.
Because it just doesn't exist, right? The Moffat era is aware that it's a story. All the characters sort of know their characters in a story, but that doesn't for a second take away from the fact that it materially exists. In the sense of material analysis, material reality.
Yeah.
The characters exist. Everything is tangible. Everything makes sense as it makes sense, and all the characters' motivations are consistent. It doesn't seem that there is a material reality to this version of the show. None of it's tangible. All of it's ethereal concepts that don't really interact with each other in deducible ways.
Just on that note, like Passenger, for example, when they have Swarm and Azure have 5 passengers, and each one can contain endless lives, and basically all of the purpose of that is just so they can poof the passengers into dust and go, ha, we've massacred billions, ha, oh my god, it's a massacre in there. And it's just like this vague, intangible version of like slaughtering loads of people that we can do with one actor in a room and a mask that we bought off of an online shop. And it really is that sense of like etherealness, just intangibility, and just vaguely maybe alluding to something really awful happening, but we don't feel it. It has no weight. I think things just don't have weight in this kind of storytelling.
It's like freezing planets in little ice crystals.
Yeah, exactly.
But all the planets are already dead, so, it's just unclear. It's all so unclear and unsubstantial. No, I feel like I need to say I did like this episode. I am absolutely dragging it, but I did actually really enjoy it.
Yeah, I liked it a lot more than last week. I was stunned at seeing people compare it to the Timeless Children and the Battle of Ranskor of Kolos. I didn't get that impression of this. Maybe I think the distance, because there's a big distance between series in this era, I think maybe the distance from the Timeless Child's transmission, because I don't think many people are like me and have rewatched it a bunch of times, has kind of dulled its impact to some people. Because if you go back and watch it, it's so much of it is the Doctor stuck on those hula hoops getting lore explained to her. Like, an unfathomable amount of the episode is just that. There is stuff like that in Once Upon a Time, but there's also a bunch of different settings. There's a bunch of different characters. There's a bunch of different things going on. And yeah, I think a lot of them are kind of flat. I think Vinder's backstory isn't very exciting or dramatically interesting, but it is a different thing to look at. There's a different set. There's different characters. It's a fucking universe away from the Timeless Children to me. There's enough different things in this episode and some actually interesting ideas to keep me fairly entertained for a lot of it. I think it's crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like it a lot more than a lot of other episodes in that sense.
I wrote down just after the episode, there is zero chance I feel any real emotions for the rest of this era of Doctor Who. Which again, incredibly harsh, but I just don't. I enjoy it in the scene-to-scene nonsense of it, in this episode especially, but it just doesn't have any emotional weight to me at all. I can't imagine myself being sad at any point.
Not even Belle and Vinder and their as yet unborn child?
Their child is as yet unborn, which is pretty great.
She could have just said child. She didn't need to say anything
child.
at all. I feel like
God.
The double-edged sword of making a series more serialized is that if you're bouncing off it like this, it's more merited than usual because it's going to be more consistent than usual, supposedly, because it's more serialized. It's more of a piece than series 11 and 12 were. And I feel like that's the thing with how some people are reticent to come down either way on episodes too quickly after the transmission, is like there is this massive weight of over 20 hours behind us of expectations and of understandings. And I'm not on my phone watching this show, you know. I make every effort. I'm staring at the screen. My arms are folded. I'm drinking it all in. I'm really engaging with this stuff. And that affects how I'll engage with it the week after. So when you bounce off something like this and you say, I can't feel emotions in this era anymore, I feel like some people are going to be like, that's such a scathing or negative thing to say. You're not giving it a chance. But we've given it like 22, 23 chances. You know what I mean? It's an era. It's not... You can't treat these as episodes in a vacuum, but then also deflect to, well, it's also a serialized series, you know, so you can't be judging that element of it yet. You can't have it one way or the other. And I feel like the tendency to kind of switch positions to defend the episodes whatever way you can indicates something weird about the era, a kind of vacuousness maybe, that the arguments in defense of it can, to my mind, switch so fundamentally. I'm not quite sure what it's saying, but I feel like it's saying something.
I think it's fully valid. I don't want to invalidate anyone who likes this era. It's fully valid to, for whatever reason, really love this era and it's your favourite. But every conversation, at least that I've had about it, well, no, that's not true. Not all of them. But the vast majority of conversations with the people most defensive, most aggressively defensive about this era, is this absence of a position. It's jumping around, flipping your argument every sentence to get whatever defense you can out of it. It's almost an insecurity about it. And I think that's a shame, because I would much rather people just enjoy it for what it is and not feel that.
If I'm very personally attached to something, I'll often do that in defense of something, and I might notice myself doing it. I notice I'm switching arguments because I feel very emotional about something and I feel a need to defend it. And so the argument itself isn't so much the thing as much as how I feel about the thing.
Yeah.
I don't do this with TV so much, but I absolutely do this with other things. So I kind of understand it from that regard. I don't want to project. Maybe all these Chibnall fans aren't doing it in that way at all. but I feel like I can kind of relate to it maybe in that sense. And I can understand being attached to this era. I'm attached to bits of it. There's aspects of it that I love that it's done. And especially, I mean, the elephant in the room is it's the first showrunner that had the guts to cast a female doctor. You know, that is a huge shining light and thing to fixate on. And I think we all want that to be good. And I think it's not even, I mean, the archetypes of Yaz and the archetypes of even Ryan can attract affection and recognition of them, or relating to them, or projecting something that fits fairly easy onto them. But I feel like in that, especially a show with as rich a fandom as this one, I feel like sometimes we get this kind of, I've called it a shadow show before. It's like a secondary show. It's not the one actually on screen, but it's one that the fandom as a whole, or segments of the fandom, kind of collectively imagine up or agree upon as happening. Like, have you seen with Moffat, the Pandorica speech often gets singled out as, wasn't it so annoying how Moffat always would come back to these big melodramatic speeches and the Doctor would save the day with a speech, and Moffat was so egotistical, his doctors were so egotistical, high off giving those speeches. You guys have both seen this kind of argument, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes very little sense because the episode is literally about the opposite of that. The speech doesn't work. The speech was a trap. The enemies were just entertaining the Doctor's proclivity to make speeches like that. The episode itself is literally doing the opposite of what these people are criticizing. And yet it kind of gets remembered after the fact as doing the other thing. And I feel like with this era of Doctor Who, there's kind of this secondary 13th Doctor bubbled up by the talent and imagination of the fandom, by some great fan art, by some great fan comics, by this investment people have in wanting this character to be good. And conversations in the fandom get confusing, I think, because some people engage so much with this potentially much superior version of the character, and then they might be talking to someone who's very fixated on specific things the character did in an episode. And I feel like there's a kind of discussion at cross purposes there. It's like, I think last week I mentioned how some of the Thasman investment comes from, like, I've seen fan videos of Thasman all the time that are using clips of Jodie Whittaker and Mandip Gill out of character, which is so fascinating to me because those aren't the characters, but they look like the characters. And so there's this kind of secondary fuzzing around. It's not the show, but it's kind of, the paratext of the show is kind of being consumed and discussed like the show itself. So I feel like a lot of discussion of this era kind of comes back to that point. I hope I made any sort of sense at all in describing that.
Yeah.
I know, yeah, you definitely did.
On the Shadow... Yeah, great point. On the Shadow show of Moffat's in Pandorica Opens specifically, people always take the Rivers line about there was an imp or a monster that got put in a cell by a great wizard, and she says, I always hate wizards in stories, they always turn out to be the Doctor. People always take that line out of context as a show of Moffat's version of the Doctor as a great wizard who's mythic and perfect, forgetting that the whole story, the whole point of that is that the Doctor's the imp.
Yeah.
The Doctor's the one in the cell in that story. The people have this mythic version of the show that they engage with instead. I think people invest so much energy into making the 13th Doctor work for them. Not everyone. There's lots of 13th Doctor fans who just love the character as she actually is on screen.
Yeah.
But again, I don't want to dunk on specific people, but there was an argument going around a few months ago that the Doctor is an alcoholic because in, is it Ascension of the Cybermen, she offers someone,
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
is it a ginger sweet?
Something like that, yeah. I remember the exact discourse that you're talking about here. Truly
And there's a
insane.
spin-off comic from 20 years ago that suggests that ginger has an intoxicating effect on Time Lords, which implies that...
Yes, an alcoholic with anger issues.
Yeah.
I genuinely really love the creativity of fandom in doing this kind of thing. I see people come up with the wildest takes to me to kind of spin in faction paradox stuff into episodes by writers who I think may have never even heard of that concept at all. I feel like there's so much imagination and effort and creativity being put in by fans into kind of making these second or shadow versions of characters or episodes and things. I love that. I mean, I love reading old fanzines. I love the old stuff from the wilderness years where this was the show, you know, where there wasn't official television being made. And so this stuff, the fandom bubbles up, very much was the show in a real sense. But it just gets tricky. And I don't think this is a bad thing, but you know, we're all on Twitter together. We're all on the internet together, and we're all talking about the episodes together. But we're coming from such radically different places sometimes. Sometimes I want to be really specific, talking about just the text and just the writer, and I want to talk really author-centric with it. I want to talk very much just what's in the script, because I like being very material a lot of the time. I like that there's a hard and fast thing we can all look at the same way because we all got the same thing. We all got the same episode. We all got the same lines of dialogue. I love that. That really appeals to me, the kind of stability of that. And then I love the creativity of the fuzziness that the fans make up around it. But then when we like get an argument of the 13th Doctor, I think in a very real sense, we're talking about different characters. I don't have this experience of the 13th Doctor that they've created in a sense. They don't have this experience of interpreting the Doctor maybe narrowly like I'm doing. And so I see so much conflict sometimes between fans. I think it's a shame because I think both fans are often creative and have huge interest in the show, but we're all kind of in our little separate Flux worlds of the show itself. It's interesting stuff.
I think if I were to try and make this really wanky, just one thing, I think the central idea of perhaps the possibly deranging effect of everyone working overtime to kind of craft over narrative deficiencies in the source text or whatever. I think you could almost view that as like the founding kind of central conceit of the modern era, or like of the neoliberal age. Just people en masse endlessly working overtime to kind of paper over the cracks in a fundamentally hollow core mythology. That's maybe unfair, but I just feel like the parallel is there with just like this insane defensiveness that people have, and just kind of the way that the discourse has just gone absolutely insane in this era, even relative to Moffat's era. I just feel like there's parallels to that in the wider world. You can make a political point.
That's good. That's good stuff.
We talked about idealism and materialism separately in this discussion, but I think there's a lot of stuff there. There's that kind of lack of grounding, and words can be shifted around to mean anything when we kind of unleaven ourselves from the text in a way. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes it's really creative, but there is this kind of not alienation, but this kind of, we're adrift from each other in that sense of how it's done.
I think that's one of the big things about last series and the Timeless Children in particular, is that it absolutely cleaved the fandom in half. Not just in whether people liked it or not, but how people think about the show. And as much as we like to say that everyone can have their own interpretation, we all still have to talk to each other, and we have to have some common ground to do that on. And so when people talk about how much they spin out fantasies about Morbius Doctor adventures or whatever, and they fold in millions of years of Doctor Who adventures before the show began in that gap, and people fantasizing about the Ruth Doctor and how great it would be if she got a series, I can't help but bump against that as somebody who's interested in the material, fictional but material reality of the written story. I can't help go, but it's not the same person, right? It's not, they might call themselves the Doctor, and they might functionally be a Doctor in the sense that Clara or Jackson Lake or that Flesh avatar are the Doctor, but isn't the same person as this Doctor, is a totally distinct being with different experience. I can't care about any of that backstory, because it's not something that actually happened to this character.
And that whole idea of infinite content kind of scares me, personally. It's like, it's like cosmic horror. Like, no, this infiniteness is bad. I want specific things.
On from that, the idea that the Doctor is a character who can be said to have experienced specific things and have some kind of coherent emotional journey over however many years, entirely gone. And obviously it was always pretty tenuous anyway. But the idea that we could say that this is one character across this whole story is evaporated now, especially in the community.
The only thing in the, like, I think disagreement is healthy. I think we all take it personally so much at times because the series means a lot to people who are talking about it in these kind of contexts that we are. The only thing that personally I really dislike is the kind of insinuation you guys have gotten this sometimes, I'm sure, of you're not engaging with it fully enough, or you're not giving it enough time or giving it enough of a chance. I hate that. I watch every episode of this era a ridiculous amount of times. I watch all the commentaries. I watch every special feature. I read every stupid fucking Radio Times article. I have DVDs of all of Chibnall's past shows. You know, I engage with this so much. I'm sure there are people who engage with it more than me, but I don't like when we write off each other's opinions. And I feel like this goes for everyone, whether they're a huge fan or not. I just think it's the most facile and kind of least interesting thing to do is kind of insinuate, oh, well, your opinion doesn't count so much because you didn't do this or you didn't do that. I think it comes to the thing with writing off the series, like how Oliver talked about the difficulty in emotionally engaging with it after this episode as he realized. I think people talk about the show in these terms and they think, oh, they've written it off, and they see it as coming from a lack of imagination or inertia or not being open-minded or being kind of lazy or being a phone watcher or whatever else. But I often think for people like us anyway, it's actually coming from the opposite place. It's coming from engaging with the era so much, thinking about it so much, talking about it so much that you get a very keen sense of the shape of it. Like when we talk about our expectations for Yaz and 13 stuff, we're not just going, oh, well, it probably won't happen because blah, 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 I don't feel like it. It's because we've watched so many hours of the show already and we've really thought over the patterns in them already. It's like, I feel like someone who watched The Timeless Children once and might not have thought much over it could now be experiencing Flux in a way where they're anticipating the finale in a way I'm not. And I would suggest that it's possible they're engaging with the series less than me in a way, which I don't think is a bad thing, but I've spent more time with it, you know, I've thought about it an awful lot. Is this giving me a worse experience? I don't think of it that way because it's media. I'm interested in engaging with it as it is. That's fun to me. I have a lot of fun having these sorts of conversations, watching these episodes over and over. It's fun to think about media in this way to me. But yeah, I dislike when we insinuate other people or they insinuate to us that you're not really watching it, or, you know, you don't get to have that opinion because XYZ.
I wrote 10 full-ass essays about the episodes of last series. I've not approached a series of any TV show with that in-depth in-depth work over such a long period of time before. It was drawing blood from stones. I'm not engaging with it, right? I'm engaging with it. I still don't like it very much.
I think it's very easy for engaging less with the material side to lead to more excitement in some ways. It's a bit like just basically what we're talking about. And the idea that those who have engaged more may be a bit less excited. Because I think if I watch something and I continually imagined how every last detail of that thing could actually be setting up a potential masterpiece a few weeks down the road, or this could be setting up some amazing fucking conceptual hypothetical story, if I was doing that constantly, I could convince myself to enjoy just about anything, irrespective of its content, but I would be enjoying it in an incredibly superficial, trivial and interchangeable way. And I wouldn't really be learning specific things about what I like in the material media itself, or learning much about myself really. So I think it's just very easy to kind of just sort of slip into the fantasy land and the ideal land and not really connect with what's actually happening on your screen.
I think it confuses some people because there's kind of an abstraction in, we might not enjoy a specific episode, but we enjoy the kind of discursive stuff around it. We enjoy engaging with it and talking about it with other people. I think for some people, enjoyment can be in a more straightforward sense. Like if they enjoy the hour of television, they enjoy the hour of television. The thought of watching something they don't enjoy, but kind of enjoying analyzing it and stuff is kind of more foreign to them. I'm wired for doing this. This is what I love to do, whether it's good or bad. I love looking at something and breaking it down and thinking about it. But you see how there are some people who groan when you get into the bones of a story this way. And I understand that position, but it's a real multifaceted place, the fandom, I suppose.
You know what all this talk about shadow shows and stuff reminds me of?
Class.
That Instagram story from Doctor Who, BBC America, questioning people on which version of history they preferred, Russia or Sontar.
Yeah,
Because that reminded me of exactly what Neo was talking about last week, and a perfect illustration, I think, of just how that weird Russophobia can just be it can be maybe worse than it seems.
I was very upset to feel vindicated by what we were talking about last week when that came up on the Doctor Who BBC America Instagram stories. Yeah, the comments depressed me more than the post itself, though. And I mean, it's BBC America. Like, it's not like Chibnall has thought of that and posted it. It's not like anyone that directly works with them have done so. But I hate seeing the talk about the show being centered on something like that. Yeah.
I like how this episode set us on this whole existential rumination sort of track.
Oh, have we talked about Ruth in the episode yet? Much? Like the actual experience of flicking back and forth between Ruth and Jodie?
I felt the moments where we actually directly cut back and forth between 13 and Ruth in the same scene, giving more or less the same sort of speech, it was almost daring us to compare their performances again. And I think the way that Ruth is positioned as this kind of guest star doctor kind of almost puts her in opposition to Whittaker, because it's this possibility of an alternative kind of first female doctor that we kind of don't get very much of. And I think it's maybe not so wise to kind of cut Ruth in like this, because it just maybe, I don't want to say it's unflattering to Whittaker, but it just puts them in this unpleasant kind of competition with each other. And I think most people just rather have more Ruth, like, and let Ruth be fully, like, be herself and have more screen time to herself, you know?
At a certain point, Jodie warping into another person's body really sold her as a performer. That was when she was in the other cop's body talking about going down the supermarket. I really liked her there. I thought she was great. But her playing Ruth really didn't work.
13 as the cop reminded me of adult life skills and her character in that film, like before she started playing the Doctor, and just how people thought she might, that side of her that people thought she might bring to the Doctor, but more or less didn't really very much. Like, whenever we see a slightly different side of Whittaker as a performer in the show, it feels like a sort of bolt from the blue, because for so much of it, she's in those two modes that you described earlier.
I know this has become such a relatively mainstream point of view that I'm seeing, like, maybe contrarian takes to it now, but I really, really, really like Jo Martin as the Doctor. It really sings to me, that performance. I think some of it is kind of isolated to this context where we have a very passive Doctor, and then we get this much more authoritative, commanding, owns the room Doctor. It feels maybe stronger to us for coming right after Jodie, like literally in this scene, switching between them like that. But the use of Ruth in this episode, again, it's that Chibnall is his own worst enemy thing of we get this Doctor who a lot of us really, really love again. And again, like the timeless children, she's relegated to like just giving little bits of advice to Jodie's Doctor and not really being in it very much, and certainly not being like the main character part of any of it. And again, I feel like an episode like this could have opened us up. Like, what if instead of Jodie fluxing into Jo, it was the other way around? What if Jo Martin got the bulk of the episode and we had fun with her interacting with Mandip and that? There's timey-wimey reasons that could have worked. It's all, time is broken apart. Of course, this could have worked and been really interesting to kind of switch Doctors like that. But again, she's the advice-giving Doctor, which, yeah.
She was actually there on set, which I didn't figure watching it. She filmed, so presumably, pretty much that whole sequence exists as performed by Jo Martin. I want to see that.
And also the idea of throwing Joe Martin in with the current companions like Dan and Yaz and stuff, and having them meet her is so fun and exciting because like rather than Yaz just being like, Doctor, what's going on with you? And the Doctor's like, fuck off, Yaz, I'm not telling you. Like to have Yaz and Dan suddenly meet the fugitive and then be like, Doctor, who was that? Who was that other woman who said she was you? Then the Doctor could be like, fuck off, Yaz, but at least there'd be something to provoke that, you know? Just that idea of, you know, some conflict, having some secrets exposed for once, you know?
And it would make the companions an active part of the story, which, can you imagine? I thought there was something really neat about that division sequence that I'm not sure was intentional, but it's got a really mythic vibe to it. I mean, the temple's obviously trying to be as mythic as possible, but even the redesigned, or the earlier version of Swarm, who's less sort of camp, postmodern Moriarty type, and more... Game of Thrones style, big elf villain type. The even Passenger, who's reminded me of like Greek mythology, the idea of there being a faceless person who's a vessel of souls. You know, that's mythic. That's really cool. And the idea of flashing back into the Doctor's history and it's basically a myth is really neat, but it does feed back into what you were talking about, which is the really problematic way they're doing Jo Martin as the Doctor, which I think is upsetting everyone, whether they like the era or not, where we just want to see her actually get to be the Doctor a bit, rather than being this vague background helping hand Doctor.
If I can do another facile comparison to the extended universe, Passenger holding in, like, people abstract stuff inside him reminded me of the human TARDISes from the 8th Doctor novels. I thought that was cool.
Yeah. They mentioned last week that their names were translations.
Yeah.
And I assumed that Passenger meant TARDIS somehow. Sort of in that Doctor's wife reversal of roles way, that the TARDIS is a passenger along with the Doctor's adventures. And that I thought Azure somehow tied to the blue of the TARDIS. I've got no idea what any of it means now, but I was making that TARDIS comparison last week.
The other vaguely relevant thing about the extended universe here, I would say, is because most of us love Jo Martin and that Doctor and want to see more of her and not just in a little advicey roles like this, I see a lot of people sometimes are mollified by that lack of potential being used by the maybe near inevitability that she'll end up doing audio drama box sets of the Fugitive Doctor, whether it's Division Days or whatever else. And I hate that because of course I'd listen to them and of course I'd like to get any more of this Doctor, but it feels like such a celebration of a loss to me to be like, oh, it's okay, we're gonna get audio dramas of this character eventually. I love audio dramas, but it's like why can't
you love stories?
I love stories, but so much of the discourse about this era, I feel like, is sometimes wanting to wish for less. Like I want Ruth to have a big episode to herself, or to have a era of her own right, or whatever else. I don't find they'll get a book, or they'll get a comic, or they'll get an audio as inspirational as others might, although I consume it all the same. Yeah,
it ties into, I think, this broader acceptance that this era isn't actually about telling stories. It's just ideas getting thrown out there and someone else will come along later and make them into stories. You know, you see people saying that all the time about the companions. One day the fam are going to get a really fleshed out bit of characterization, be it through comics or coming back one day or Big Finish or whatever. And it's just such a shame because that's what this is for. Telling their stories should be this era.
I saw someone today arguing that the impact font, the orange, the coordinates, we're not equipped to judge this yet because you never know what's going to happen in a future episode in the era.
Yeah, you can't judge the random coordinates because maybe the random coordinates mean something. People are going to be saying that.
Chibnall just mashed his keyboard for those. He just mashed his keyboard.
He just mashed his keyboard?
Yeah, he let me... If he has a cat, he let it walk over the keyboard, you know, it's that sort of thing.
Yeah. people were saying you can't judge the Stenza not getting paid off in Series 11 because his era's not over yet, and don't you know the Stenza are going to come back? And I bet anything that once this series is done, any loose threads will be excused by we've got specials left to go, and once the specials are done, they'll be excused by, well, maybe RTD will do something with them.
I think even it'll be stop eating the sour grapes. You know, like, this era's done. Why are you dragging it out to, you know, to insult it again? Let's enjoy RTD2 now. It's because it's not really, a lot of the times, I don't think it's really about the specific argument people are making. It's just about trying to stop the argument happening at all by putting it off to some point that'll never come. It's a point on the horizon that we can never actually reach, because you can always make up a justification for why you can't judge something yet.
None of us are Americans, but, you know, don't criticize Joe Biden, don't criticize Joe Biden.
Yeah.
You'll make him lose the election, and then you'll make him lose his power in the first few weeks, and then you'll make him lose the midterms. There's never an opportunity to actually criticize.
It's because it's never about that.
That's what I was talking about, that parallel between the show and kind of neoliberal ideology. Like, it's all the same kind of basic thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I had more to say, but it's too early to judge, so I want to do it again. I want to do it now, I mean. In the Halloween Apocalypse discussion, I talked a bit about how a lot of the observations and analysis and criticisms of Series 11, like ones Gig and I were making at the time, but beyond that, like Andrew Ellard, all sorts of people were getting this, were met with, it's too early to judge in 2018. And I feel like it was a much more defensible position then, although I still don't think it was right, because we might have only been one episode into the era, or only 2 episodes into the era. And so arguments like they're finding their feet, or you're being lazy or shallow, or you have poor literacy with media to be making judgments like that on a series before it had concluded, they felt a little bit more merited then, or at least a little bit more sensible 20 hours later.
Yeah.
Well, 20 hours later, we have Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3 in the title cards. And so I think that raises the argument again in an interesting way, because now I don't think it's just a fan-led thing. Like I felt like it's too early to judge thing before. I never felt like Chibnall and Strevens were saying anything like that. I feel like the fans were saying that. But now the chapters and the title cards, I think, give a little bit more material for an argument that you don't judge this as a standalone episode because it's part of something. But that said, they're still episodes, and I think it's really interesting to think about the format in this way. And the reason I'm leery about the not judging elements of Flux yet isn't because I'm really eager to come down on any sort of judgment of it unduly early. It's because I'm engaging with what we're getting, which is a series of 6 episodes of weekly television where we get one a week. And whenever Chibnall and Strevens talk about the format of the series, the big cliffhangers or the nature of the structure, I feel like they're talking about it in that context. So when people later binge it in one go on iPlayer or the Blu-ray or whatever, it's a secondary experience compared to what Chibnall and Strevens originally made and initially transmitted. Doctor Who is still television. It's broadcast on televisions for television. And on that basis, the series being more serialized than usual doesn't discount judgment of anything in its individual episodes, I don't think. I think it invites it, because things are introduced in serialized series like this to induce conversations week to week. Does the BBC want people not to tune in for the 6 weeks and they want them to wait and watch it on iPlayer? I don't think so, but it's a genuine question. Like, if people do think that, I want to hear that point of view. But what I'm getting at is the way the show actually transmits, it is these week-to-week episodes. And so I don't think it makes sense to table thoughts, because you can always have the later thoughts later, but you can only have the week-to-week thoughts now. And I feel like there's this kind of engaging with an appeal to possibility where some people conceptualize this kind of ideal of how the show could or should be viewed, and then they discuss it in that context. But these episodes were designed to have around 170 hours sit between them. And so them being more serialized than usual, I don't think it means that there should be less conversation in between those 170 hours. It's an interesting viewpoint, and I think it's worth discussing whether it means that or not. But I don't like being prescriptivist about how you should or shouldn't approach an episode. I don't like leaving conversations off the table because of the structure of a series, because we can always talk about it that way when it's done, but we can't talk about how it was week to week after those weeks unless we somehow isolate ourselves from all spoilers and things like that.
It's like it's evolved from turn your brain off while watching it to turn your brain off for 7 days after watching it as well.
Yeah. And I think it's very specifically in the defense of this era and as Doctor Who, because people aren't saying the same thing, I don't think, about similarly serial shows, right? People aren't saying you can't judge episode 1 of Watchmen because you can't have an opinion on it because it's not the end yet, right? Because this isn't... This is Doctor Who doing Netflix modern style serial dramas, and it very much is that. Like, this episode felt wacky and experimental for Doctor Who, but it's an extremely common trope in modern serial series. It's, there's 2 episodes of Watchmen, which is this, right?
Yeah.
There's most series that are structured like this have a flashback episode. WandaVision had one. And they've all got one. And you don't get people... or at least I've not seen people defending those series and problems that turn up in them by saying, well, you can't judge whether that thing is good yet because the series isn't over yet and maybe it'll all be made good this time next year. I think people are specifically struggling to defend this with those kinds of techniques, maybe because this isn't the kind of thing Doctor Who does.
I think it's a huge disservice to Chibnall and Strevens to kind of discuss it in that way of, well, we can't talk about this thing yet, or it doesn't make sense to talk about it this way yet because it's not finished. Like with Broadchurch, that show was so clearly designed, like all sorts of mystery serialized shows, to be discussed week to week. The space between the episodes is so clearly part of their design. It's to get people talking. That's what it wants to encourage, the water cooler conversations. And so I feel like it's abstracting the series out so strangely to try and maybe discourage that. We only get these 1 weeks, this temporal circumstance, to discuss in this way. I think it's a really precious thing, and I think it's a disservice to try and dismiss those. And yeah, we've watched Lindelof's shows, we've watched other mystery shows, Broadchurch and other things like that. Like, I don't think anyone here is unfamiliar with serialized television. You can reread a book countless times, but you can only have the non-spoiled first read of it once. And so I think trying to set aside what I see the equivalent of that it's a disservice to the writers, to me, and what everyone's done here. Because it is a special thing to do a serialized series. And I feel like the joy of that is the observations you make week to week in the spaces between them. It's not like a Netflix blob where it feels like a 8-hour movie just arbitrarily chopped up, because look at these huge cliffhangers and look how each episode does have a specific different focus. It's a big serialized linked story, but these are still very much episodes, so it just doesn't make any sense to me to treat them otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one of the big successes of Flux is that this is a good structure, I think, for Doctor Who. It's not massively original, but it works. I'm not sure if I called it on the show, but having a entire series set within the clicking of Swarm's fingers, was having the whole episode set within that was exactly what I wanted this to be, and it was that. And I think that kind of structural weirdness is really cool and a really fun thing to do with Doctor Who, because it's taking a normal Doctor Who episode idea and folding it into a larger story. I think that's great, but people using that serialization to almost discredit each individual episode as a story is such a shame. And it's trying to dodge the criticisms of it, but in doing so, almost ignoring it as a story in its own right.
The prediction of the future episodes is, I think, the whole central idea of these serialized things. Like you saying, I don't think I can emotionally connect with the future episodes. That's a consequence of what the episodes we've seen have been doing. It's a big part of what the show's doing. Like us wondering, is the spooky house going to pay off? The episode is inviting that. That's why the spooky house is there. That's why this stuff is there. It's not like that exists in isolation in the series to just be a scene we see in episode 2 and go, yep, that's a weird scene in episode 2. And that's it. No, it's there to get you thinking about the future episodes. I feel like that's the whole thing with the week-to-week experience, is the guessing at future episodes. That's what Serialized Mystery is about. That's Broadchurch Series 1. Every week you're thinking, well, are they the killer? The character this episode's focusing on? Oh, well, the end made me change my mind. Maybe it's this other guy now. You watch it all in one blob and you don't get that discursive element of that, and it's not designed to be consumed that way. So
yeah, exactly. Which is what I sort of hate Broadchurch, because I think I watched it like that. I had no room in between week to week to talk about it. So for me, it was just a long string of red herrings that got set up and then discarded without any actual character groundwork. But watching it week to week, like you're doing this, is much better. You much more get that that conversation around it, and to discard that is a real shame. Talking of the spooky house, where's everyone sitting on the Longborough meter? If we had a scale of 1 to 10 of how Longborough it is.
I'm kind of leaning away from it's the house the Doctor is from in some sense now. I think it's the I think Gig might have come up with this, not me, but it's the place where the old woman is. I think we're gonna like pan out and it's gonna be the house. That makes sense as a connective serialized thing to me.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, some sort of place that's floating outside of the universe or whatever, where the secret, even more special beings than the Time Lords are all floating around somewhere doing some shit.
Like the Master's TARDIS in Spyfall, just a house spinning through the vortex.
Yes.
On the topic of Broadchurch, it's interesting to me that Chibnall made a comment a while ago that seemed to indicate he was prepared to change the ending of the show. He didn't say the killer, but I feel like the ending of the show is the killer, so it probably meant that if the identity of the killer had leaked out to the press earlier, and so audiences had got wind of that. But Series 12's plot, like all the big spoilers of that, leaked out way in advance. I remember reading them on Gallifrey base, and I don't think anything changed. So I don't know whether it was just a very different context and Chibnall had a very different view to it in terms of Doctor Who, or the fact it was on Gallifrey base and not the Mirror or something influenced his decision. But I've just always found that an odd thing, that he had this big gung-ho attitude toward leaks with Broadchurch, to the extent he would have changed the show if they'd eventuated. He's very spoiler-phobic with Doctor Who itself. Enormous Series 12 spoilers happened, and I never felt any kind of response to them.
How the hell would he have changed the Time of the Children, given like the state of Series 12's production? Like, that would require them to have shot some sort of alternate ending, and considering they barely shot enough as it is, like, I don't see that materialising.
It's a very different thing to a killer, I guess. Yeah, it's Jodie Whittaker made a comment that a lot of people interpret as Chibnall having come up with the timeless stuff when he was a kid. And so in that case, it's probably too precious to him to change just because Gallifrey base got wind of it.
Yeah. I'm not entirely unconvinced by the suggestions that there's another layer to the Timeless Child stuff to happen this series. I don't think there is, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a further twist on top of the twist.
Yeah.
To happen later in the series. Actually, I forgot to mention this earlier, but that was one thing that I thought about this episode, is at no points was I even vaguely surprised by anything. It's got big twists like Joe Martin turning up, but you sort of assumed that.
Yeah.
Like, the whole thing was pretty obvious. Vinder's backstory is basically what I thought it would be based off his introduction.
I mean, Vinder's backstory, if Vinder had been introduced in 2005, his backstory would have been clarified in 2 lines of dialogue, like Jack's was. Here we get, it feels like it goes on for half an hour.
Full episode.
On Jack, 2 things about Jack I want to say. One is that I forgot to mention this last week, but in around April this year, it came out that there was going to be a Doctor Who comic with Captain Jack that would tie into the 2nd episode of Series 13. The blurb came out on some website. A thrilling new Doctor Who graphic novel which stars fan favourite Captain Jack Harkness as he goes up against the insidious Torchwood Institute. In the midst of kicking alien butt and looking good doing it, Captain Jack Harkness is suddenly transported through a time window to 19th century Cardiff again, Realizing there's more than one thing afoot, he sets out to uncover what the Victorian-era Torchwood Institute team are up to behind closed doors, hoping to solve the mystery of why time windows are cropping up everywhere. He finds something unexpected, old friends, yada yada. This bold new tale ties in directly with episode 2 of the hotly anticipated Series 13.
Directly with episode 2?
There was no 19th century. Was there? Yeah, it was. I didn't get a sense of that, so I wonder if something was cut. The comic itself was cut after the Barrowman allegations. It got cut in June. But it was interesting. I never thought of that once watching War of the Sontarans, although I remember reading that Barrowman stuff months ago.
Well, I think it could have been basically anything, because the whole premise with, time windows, time is getting fluxed, Sontarans are perverting the course of human history. I feel like you could make basically anything out of that. So Jackson back in the past, and maybe there's Sontarans there or something. Like, I don't know, it could be anything.
I'm struggling to see how the Liverpool tunnels are tying into things. So that suggests to me that might have been connected somehow, because that lines up era-wise, right?
Yeah.
I get the impression from this episode that the tunnels will involve the time particles things,
Yeah.
because that's what we saw him kind of shooting at in this episode. So I feel like maybe that'll just be the setting for the finale, and that'll be the big fight with the time particles.
I am enjoying that guy cropping up in every episode, being a bit wacky.
I loved his acting for this one.
Yeah.
He really went hammy with that. With Vinder and Jack, when Vinder was first announced, I saw some people were interpreting it as he was like an XP for Jack, like circumstances, whether COVID or cancellation related, prevented Barrowman from being part of Series 13, and so this supposedly similar character came in. I don't think the timeline at all lines up for it, but I don't really get much of a similarity. Vinder doesn't even have a ship, so I think that's some Series 13 discourse that aged poorly. What do you guys think?
I think people are trying to draw holisticism where there isn't any. People don't vibe with more extraneous characters who don't tie into stuff that's come before, but more extraneous characters who don't tie into stuff before is Chibnall's MO, so it shouldn't be surprising, I don't think, that he's just another guy. Unless he's the Doctor's dad.
Jack's departure in Revolution of the Daleks was so, like, ADR-y and weird that I could see people thinking COVID this, COVID that. But I think you made a point like this last week, Oliver. There's a degree to which odd writing like that isn't indicative of strange issues. It's just indicative of a kind of style.
I'm dedicated to... I really want to make the documentary about this era in a few years' time and the production issues. That fascinates me. I've written a lot about the relationship between the text and the behind the text failure to meet deadlines and other last-minute changes and whatnot, because I think it's fascinating the way those two interact. And Chibnall's style is already so frantic and confused, and throwing on top of that the fact that did it come out recently that the Master was a late addition?
Yeah, that got confirmed
Spyfall?
Recently.
As we sort of all predicted. Yeah, that's an absolutely fascinating relationship. Because you can see, I think, when a Moffat or an RTD script is rushed, and there are signs of it. I think it's much harder to tell with Chibnall because his style isn't conducive to smooth storytelling anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that's just as true here, that people are looking for COVID issues and, Barrowman getting cut because he's an inappropriate
seeing patterns
actor.
where they aren't there, basically, as is always the way.
Yeah. I did think, on COVID, just quickly, this is clearly the most COVID precaution episode, right? Everyone's split off into their own thing. We're reusing the same handful of actors to limit the cast. And there's a lot of creativity coming from that. It's a trope, but the limitation does make things interesting.
Yeah.
Having Yaz just being the guards in the Vinder's scenes. She's playing all the characters there because she's the actor they have. That's really neat.
I love COVID creativity. It's my favourite part of this series is how it was made in response to a formatting thing. I love format-specific stuff. I love how this spawned out of restraints with the actors. I think it really excited a kind of creativity in Chibnall that I didn't see so much in the last two series. I love that stuff.
There was the line in Belle's story, and I've got some stuff to say about Belle's story, but there was the line at the beginning of hers where she says, catastrophe creeps in quietly, which I thought was quite a good line, but also isn't true of the Flux. It did not creep in quietly. It destroyed the universe with a big wave. But that's obviously a COVID line, and I like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a big point around Belle, but I thought it was pretty strong, to be honest. It's obviously helped by the fact that it's all wrapped up in mystery, and we don't figure out the whole episode. Her whole story is just setting up the idea that she's trying to get back to Vinder, right? You can do that in a line if you wanted to. It's extremely inefficient storytelling-wise, but I thought she was incredibly strong. What's the actor's name?
Thadia Graham?
Thadia Graham. I think she's incredibly strong. I might be the only person who thinks that, but I think she's genuinely really good. She sells Chibnall dialogue so hard that I didn't notice the first time how Chibnall-y a lot of her dialogue was. She just emphasizes them just right, that they sell as actual things a human would say. And I thought her line about love is the only mission tied in quite nicely. It shows an actual sort of understanding of the Cybermen that goes back to Death in Heaven. Love's not an emotion, it's a promise. There's a clear through line there where there is some semblance of understanding what the point of Cybermen is, and it's to be a counterpoint to an emotional story about the characters. And I don't know, I dug her. And I didn't hate the idea of the biggest, most name recognition Doctor Who factions all warring it out in an ended universe. As an off-screen detail that the universe has ended, and so all the militaristic species are just fighting over what's left with no motive other than they like fighting. They're always going to be fighting over something. I thought that was sort of neat. I'm not particularly interested in where it goes, and I'm thinking it's pretty convincing that her baby is a setup for the putting a timeless child through a vortex. People have been saying that, and I think that's not unconvincing. But I just thought she was really strong, and I would like to see more of her.
Her story is about the Flux in a way a lot of the other stories haven't been, I think, this series and this episode. So I think actually exploring the universe that has gotten all messed up is more interesting to me, like she was doing, rather than getting like this stock cop story with Vinder or whatever else in this episode.
I think I do just slightly tire of Chibnall doing the whole dystopian environment, stragglers fighting, the last survivors fighting the monsters encroaching, because, you know, it's Ascension of the Cybermen again, and it's like, I feel like Chibnall likes this stuff a bit too much. But, you know, as far as her character goes, you know, she's easy to like. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the pew-pew action with Cybermen and shit, but, like, it wasn't some horrible thing, you know. It wasn't one of the problems with the episode, I found.
It's really interesting for how much Chibnall leans on the anti-gun stuff for the Doctor, how much he clearly loves writing characters who shoot stuff. He's got no moral issues with any of the side cast shooting Cybermen in the head, or Vinder shooting at Swarm last episode. He's totally fine with all that stuff. He's got no moral objections to it. He just knows that the Doctor does, so he has to write her not liking guns, even though he clearly loves writing characters shooting stuff.
He had a lot of fun on Torchwood with schlocky gunplay stuff, so yeah, I agree.
Yeah, didn't he? His big sell for an episode is often there's two side characters who are going to get together, and aren't you invested in that? Just as if the concept of a man and woman having a kiss by the end is going to draw me in.
Yeah, we know Belle will survive because she's heterosexual.
Yeah, exactly.
I still remember the ardent shipping of Ravio and Graham. That's never went anywhere. So we compare to other showrunners and episodes a lot. We did it in this one. We did it last week. Doctor Who fans do it a lot in general. Lawrence Miles once said something like Doctor Who is sort of his native language, like it's a shorthand to talk about other things because it's something he has so much familiarity with and has grown up with, you know, absorbing all sorts of stories from it. So it's this kind of thing in your brain where you can make lots of connections through Doctor Who because there's a Doctor Who story like that, or there's a Doctor Who writer that exemplifies that. And in the last Doctor Who magazine, Chibnall himself said, with anything you do on Doctor Who, usually somehow there's an echo of a precedent in there. And I don't want to give the impression that, like, when we bring up Moffat did this or an RTD episode did that, that it's inherently like a this current thing is bad, this past thing was good, yeah, type thing. I think most of the times it's either a story outright invites it in one way or another, like Fugitive of the Judoon has the Judoon return, it's promoted on the basis of the conversations you'll get about the RTD era based on bringing the Judoon back. And I think a lot of other times it's just when you're talking about Doctor Who stories, seasons, writers, the most effective and quickest way to get a concept across to who you're talking to or your audience when they're another Doctor Who fan or multiple Doctor Who fans is to use Doctor Who as a shorthand. Like, there's a big part of other novels I've read that I could compare this episode to and use as a springboard for discussing the topics we discussed about this episode and what I think works and doesn't. But I'm not doing that because I'm on a Doctor Who channel. I'm talking about Doctor Who with other Doctor Who viewers, two Doctor Who viewers. So I feel like using Doctor Who and related shows like spin-offs and other shows by the showrunners is a kind of inclusive thing in the sense that the point being made has a better chance of making sense to people than bringing in, you know, so-and-so other thing that connects to the episode and your experience, but a lot of other Doctor Who fans might not have any familiarity with it. I don't think anyone shuts out bringing in other texts in, like we discussed Lindelof stuff this episode. And I don't think anyone kind of thinks through this whole thought process I'm outlining here before they bring up, well, Moffat did this. But I think it's kind of a general underlying principle behind how Doctor Who fans talk about Doctor Who. So while I sympathize with people who feel like in any given era, conversations sometimes feel like a broken record of, well, another episode did this, another writer did that, I think it's just a kind of shorthand that's inclusive to other Doctor Who fans rather than explaining a story concept from the ground up like we could do, or we could just say, well, Moffat did this and everyone knows what we're talking about then. Or just using texts other Doctor Who fans have familiarity with. And so I think the nature of a show with this much content over this much time kind of arguably invites it too. And sometimes the actual stories are inviting it, like when past characters are brought in. What do you guys think of all that?
I think the only slight pitfall you get with that kind of technique, and I use it all the time, I do this all the time, I think it's like when you have something like this episode, which I don't think there is really much of a real precedent for this kind of structure, like in Doctor Who before, really. I think you get a lot of people comparing it to Moffat and saying that Chibnall is emulating Moffat here. This is a Moffat clone or whatever. If Moffat had written this, you'd love it. And I think that ends up kind of missing that Moffat never actually wrote anything like this, you know, structured like this, and it becomes again that kind of intangible, kind of vague, not really just focusing on vague memories or impressions of the past and not really engaging with the material stuff, if you see what I mean.
That circles back around to what we were saying about the kind of shadow shows that people come up, or the it's too early to judge argument, which kind of constantly puts off an argument into the future where it can never happen. If this was a Moffat episode, you'd have liked it, is not an argument. It's not about a completely intangible thing that did not happen and that cannot happen. It's a projection, it's an assumption, it's a completely superficial thing, it's not an argument. It's not material. It's not actually talking about the episode, I think. It's talking around the episode. It's that appeal to possibility again, which isn't in the episode we all watched.
Yeah.
It's this wishy-washy thing in someone's brain that we can't really discuss because it'll just keep slipping away, because there'll be another factor that this person can then introduce to say, well, you would have thought this if you thought that. Maybe I would have, because we didn't get that. We're not talking about the thing anymore. We're doing this very immaterial thing where we're talking about wisps instead of the episode itself, which maybe is what people sometimes want, because then you're not talking about the episode itself, which might have concrete issues to talk about sometimes. But if we're talking about this completely intangible impossibility of, well, if Moffat did this, it would have been like that, we're not talking about anything at all. And maybe that's the point.
The Moffat comparison, I think, comes from the fact that this is an episode that plays with visual language and filmic language, and that's something the Moffat does. But really, when people are saying that that's the connection, they're really using Moffat as a reference point within Doctor Who to talk about what is a massive thing in the rest of media. Using visual language isn't a Moffat thing. That's something that all shows use to varying degrees. And this kind of so abstracted visual language stuff and the flashbacks and the actors playing other actors isn't anything like anything Moffat's really done. But it's the closest that there is within Doctor Who. So to talk about this episode in reference to another work, people have to jump to Moffat because everyone talks about Doctor Who in reference to Doctor Who. And I think you're right that there's it's valid and helpful to do that. And Doctor Who's one of those shows which is so vast and has so much within it, and is formatted in such a way that it generates so many ideas that there is always something within Doctor Who that you can compare Doctor Who to. But I also think it's a bit pathological.
Yeah.
And I think it is when I do it too. I have an absolutely appalling habit of using Doctor Who as a comparison point for pretty much anything, because it's my native language, because I know it like the back of my hand.
Yeah.
And I got told off a few days ago by one of my friends who isn't from Britain, because I keep bringing everything back to Doctor Who, and they've never seen it, which was fair. But I think it is limiting, and I get why people do it, and I do it loads, and I did a whole thing about talking about Villa Diodati in reference to the other stories in the Doctor Who universe about Mary Shelley. I made a whole thing out of it. It's something we all do. We all talk about Doctor Who in reference to Doctor Who, but it also feels limiting. I think it's a shame we don't bring in more texts and more outside stuff. Yeah. But I guess that's the nature of fandom, is the one thing we all have in common is that we've seen this show and we know a fair bit about the stories that have happened within it. And so that's where we're going to draw our references from.
And also, there are so many texts that you can just kind of spend your life burrowing into 100 Doctor Who novels instead of reading anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a slippery thing. I feel like there's a slight distinction. Sometimes another Doctor Who thing is brought in to illustrate a point, like Diodati does X or Y, and we can make sense of this by looking at how another story did X. There's ways to bring in other episodes that starts a conversation, and then there's ways which I think is bringing in other Doctor Who writers or episodes to stop conversations or to put off conversations. And that's what I think that if Moffat wrote this, you'd have liked it thing is, because that's not really saying anything to me. It's kind of trying to put a conversation away. Whereas saying, well, in the Angels Take Manhattan, the Angels work like this. So in this story, when they work like that, it's interesting because it works as in there, blah, blah, blah. It's starting a conversation, not finishing one, I think. It's slippery to define, but I feel like there's a little distinction in that.
Yeah. Obviously, cross-referencing the texts within Doctor Who to each other is fruitful and interesting, but people are often using it to box in what Doctor Who is and say, you get it a lot with Rose 10 fans who draw all future relationships and characters in reference to those two, boxing all of Doctor Who into a little understanding of a specific corner of it, rather than using it to expand and explore what it is as a whole.
All right, and that does it for our conversation on Once Upon Time and the halfway point of this Flux series. As always, thank you very much those who have listened in. Please do feel free to comment away with any thoughts on anything we did or did not say, or anything in the episode or Flux in general at this point. And next week we'll be back for the Weeping Angels episode. Cheers!
Better written.
Pillar of Hope.
Better written. Very cliched. Better written.
Pillar of Hope.
Better written. Very cliched. But I still felt that story was fairly boring.
That's all this year is.
You don't even have to watch it in order.
Better written. Very cliched.